pain. Now it's going to be excruciating. We can't delay it anymore, right? We've now caught up to the can, and it's now so enormous that we can't kick it anymore. Getting back to what I said, if we had done the right thing and let businesses fail and let interest rates rise and replenished our savings and developed a viable economy that was self-sufficient in savings and production, right? Like it used to be when it really was a great economy. But instead, we inflated the biggest bubble that the world has ever seen, completely dependent on debt and consumption. And now that bubble is blown to smithereens, and we're going to have to deal with the consequences. The piper has been playing for decades. And the irony of it is he may want to be paid, but all we have is worthless currency to pay him in. So I think now this is like an official game of musical chairs. And you got to get out of the dollar. Not only the US dollar, not only US treasuries, but all US dollar denominated debt, because all of it is going to get bought up by the Fed, because any debt the Fed doesn't buy is going to soar in yield and collapse in price. And so that's why I think that long-term interest rates are not already soaring. It's because the Fed is in there buying, because only the Fed would be dumb enough to buy US treasuries. In fact, it's not about dumb enough, it's desperate and insane enough. And the reason they're buying is because they create the money out of thin air. So what do they give a damn what it's worth? But obviously, people who are expecting to retire or live off of the income that those bonds produce, you'd have to be a fool to buy them. In fact, right now, as I said, it's musical chairs. When the music stops, if you still have any dollars, if you still have any treasuries, muni bonds, corporate bonds, cash value left in your annuity, in your life insurance, a fixed annuity, if you have any of that stuff, when the music stops, you lose. And you don't just lose a game, you lose everything. And so you gotta make sure that you're sitting down before that music stops. And the obvious chair is gold, right? You gotta have gold. It's up over $50 an ounce today. It's a good thing that there's so much ignorance out there in the financial media, because if people on CNBC or Fox or CNN or any of these networks, if they had one person on there leveling with the American public like I am and actually telling people what's going to happen and explaining the mistakes that the Fed and Congress not only made in the past, but is making now. And if you don't know by now, if you can't see how many of my predictions have come true, things that nobody else predicted but me, at least publicly, all this stuff is happening. Things that nobody could have even imagined. People thought I was crazy when I talked about this stuff a decade ago, and it's all happening now. And some people are just focused on, well, the stock market is still up. Well, the dollar hasn't crashed. Gold's only 1,600. If you wait until all of my financial predictions come true, just like all of my economic predictions and Fed predictions have been coming true one after another, well, then it doesn't matter. I mean, you can't help yourself. You're broke. But you still have the opportunity to recognize the truth of what I've been saying and the folly of what everybody has been saying in the conventional media, and recognize that these fools on Capitol Hill who are so convinced that what the markets need is another bailout. They don't need another bailout. We need a bailout from the bailouts, but the only bailout will work is the free market. We need capitalism to bail out the economy from failed socialism. Unfortunately, we're about to elect Joe Biden. And even though he's not Bernie Sanders, he's going to govern like Bernie Sanders. He's going to be pushed to the left by the biggest economic crisis in U.S. history. Said, if you think the Great Depression was bad, you don't know anything about how bad this is going to be. Maybe so much worse. I said earlier on that during the Depression, the cost of living went down. This time, the cost of living is going to go sky high. You want to know what it's like when your money collapses in value? Take a look at some of the YouTube videos of Venezuela. It's not pretty. Yeah, they're going to try to blame it on the coronavirus. Don't believe anybody. In fact, this is probably the best news the government has had. This is the best scapegoat they could have hoped for. Oh, the coronavirus, right? This couldn't possibly be our fault. Oh, this is another 100-year flood, which we seem to have every 10 years or so. But, oh, this is totally out of left field. Nobody could have predicted this. Look, bad things happen. That's easy to predict. Exactly what? Nobody really knows. But it's going to rain. It's not always going to be sunny. And sometimes when it rains, it pours. That's why you save for a rainy day. You don't pretend that it's never going to rain and leverage yourself up to the hilt. But that's what we did as a nation, because nobody wanted to pay the cost of saving for a rainy day, because you can't spend and save the same money. If you want to build a real economy, you got to stop spending. But if you have a phony economy based on spending, if you stop spending and start saving, then the phony economy implodes, which is exactly what you want a phony economy to do. Because the sooner it implodes, the better. Because the longer you prop it up, the worse it's going to be. And we've succeeded in propping it up for so many years longer than anybody could have thought, who understood the actual nature of the problem. So now it's going to collapse in a more spectacular way than even I imagined. So the economic outcome is going to be far worse than I thought when I was writing Crash Proof in 2007. I'm not happy about that. I really wish that cooler heads would have prevailed, and that, you know, the Austrian school and people like me and others. And again, I'm not the only one. Right? I don't want to act like I'm the only one that saw this coming. I just saw it coming and explained it in a more public way than a lot of other people. And it's not that I'm so smart. I mean, it's just that everybody else is so dumb. I mean, that's the reality. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to figure this out. You just have to be a complete fool, right, to miss it. Or you're just caught up in the moment. You know, that is the problem with bubbles, right? When you are trapped in a bubble, and there are a lot of smart people who have been in this bubble for a long time. And the problem is they don't know it, right? It's like that movie, The Truman Show, right? They think it's reality. They don't know it's fantasy. But I'm not inside the bubble. I've always been kind of on the fringes. And I've been able to look at everything objectively from the outside. And from the outside, you see the bubble, right? But nobody that's in it, they're all in it together, they have no idea. And so that's why, you know, it still hasn't dawned on them that they made mistakes in 2008. They still think it worked. That's the crazy part about it. It didn't work. If it worked, they wouldn't have to do it again. Think about how much quantitative easing, the trillions and trillions and trillions that have already been committed. You know, I said this. I said that QE4, if we're going to count this as QE4 instead of 5, 6, 7, and 8. I mean, they've announced it. They announced a brand new QE program every day now. So I don't know if we just lump it all into one big QE or just keep on with the numbers, because we're already way through the Rocky movies. But why did I say from the beginning that QE4 would be bigger than QE 1, 2, and 3 combined? Because I knew that in order to try to inflate a bubble bigger than the bubble in everything that popped, they would need the most monetary stimulus ever. But I said it's not going to work. It was impossible. You cannot blow up a bubble that was bigger than the one we just had. And the reason these clowns think it worked is because the stock market made new highs. Real estate prices went up. So what? The stock market was overvalued. Even in 2008, it was overvalued. Making it more overvalued was a mistake. The real estate market was even more overvalued than the stock market. And instead of letting real estate prices keep falling, which was part of the cure, we made the economy sicker by pushing them back up again. And the reason we had the weakest recovery, but the longest lasting recovery ever, is because we didn't recover from anything. We actually got sicker the entire time they told us the economy was recovering. That's why Donald Trump got elected, because he leveled with the public about how bad the economy was and how the numbers were phony. The problem was, after he became elected, he conned the public with the same phony numbers and tried to get everybody to believe that the economy was great. And he was able to increase the illusion with deficits, with tax cut finance deficits. So he was able to blow extra air into the bubble to increase the delusion and get corporate America on board, get the Republicans on board to actually think that he had made America great again, instead of taking the bubble that he inherited from Obama, which Obama inherited from Bush, which Bush inherited from Clinton, right? We just made all those bubbles bigger. That's all we did. we continued the bubble blowing. Well, the bubble blowing stops now. This is it. And the Fed is going to destroy the dollar this time. The inflation is not going into the financial markets, right? That's why the stock market is not even really responding to the Fed stimulus. Yes, I think the market would likely be lower without all this money printing, and we may even get some kind of BS rally at some point. But gold is what's going up. The only thing is the dollar isn't tanking yet, and that's a short-term phenomenon because of this global rush for liquidity in dollars, because all this new money that the Fed is creating, a lot of it has just been committed. It hasn't actually gone into circulation yet. But once this short-term liquidity squeeze around the world ends, the dollar is going to sink like a stone. It is going to collapse. The only thing that hides how fast it's falling is that other fiat currencies are falling too, because central bankers all around the world are making the same idiotic mistakes we are. Governments all around the world are making the same idiotic mistakes our government is making. We are leading the idiot parade, and they are following us. But the difference is other economies are much sounder, right? They're the producers. They're the creditors. They don't have a complete house of cards, phony economy like we do, and they do not issue the world reserve currency. No country is going to suffer more than the United States when the current fiat monetary system comes crashing down, because we enjoy a privileged place in that system as the issuer of the reserve currency, which is a ticket to live beyond our means, to consume without producing, to borrow without saving. That's all going to come to an end. And then we're going to find out what the real problem is. The real problem isn't that consumers aren't spending. The problem is they have nothing to buy. The stimulus that has already been offered by Trump, this new stimulus package, equals like 10% of GDP. 10%, we're just getting started. During the Great Depression, for the entirety, between 1929 and 1941, just before World War II started, the entire Keynesian fiscal stimulus was only about 3% of GDP. That's it. Government spending increased by about 9% of GDP, and taxes increased by about 6%. And so the difference was 3%. That was the stimulus. That was it in the Depression. And ironically, it was the stimulus that helped create the Depression. We didn't need stimulus. We didn't need more government. We needed to be relieved with less government. Had they cut government spending instead of increased it, there would not have been a depression. That's the irony. That's what happened in 1920. 1920 got started worse than the Great Depression. The problem was it was over so quickly, they never had a chance to pass the stimulus. That's what happened. It was really, really bad, but Congress didn't get around to doing anything. And as a result, the economy healed itself. The reason we had a Great Depression in 1929 is because we weren't that lucky. Hoover came in with his idiot bailouts and stimulus, whatever they did, and turned that downturn into a Great Depression. Well, the idiots we have today, and again, the guys back then were geniuses compared to these morons. What they are going to do is they're going to turn what could have been a very severe recession into something much worse than a depression, into a inflationary depression. So as I said, you got to buy your gold, Schiff Gold. I know the guys are there somewhere answering the calls. Gold and silver, that's real money. Buy it now. I know you're going to wait 2 or 3 months to get your silver. Well, if you wait much longer to buy it, you might be waiting 6 months, a year. We may run out. Who knows what's going to happen with gold and silver? Just buy yours while you can. Use for investments. If you got bigger portfolios, you got to get out of all U.S. treasuries, muni bonds, corporate bonds, anything that's a promise to pay you dollars. Because the only thing that's going to buy less than the dollar today than the dollar in the future. And the further in the future it is, the less it's going to buy. So get rid of them. The Fed is giving you a get out of jail free card. The Fed is buying all the bonds. Sell them yours. Don't be the last one to unload their bonds on the Fed, because the longer you wait, the less purchasing power you're going to get. And you want to get into foreign assets. That's why I've been saying it's not about the market going down. It's about the dollar collapsing. Because in order to save the market and the phony economy, they sacrifice the dollar. Well, they're going to get a lot more than they bargained for. It's not like the dollar is just going to get a little beat up. It's going to get completely slaughtered. And so you got to do something. You got to move your portfolios out of dollar-denominated stuff, out of U.S. stocks too. Even though U.S. stocks, the ones that don't go bankrupt, won't lose as much as bonds. But I think U.S. stocks are going to be so taken over by socialists in Washington. There's going to be so much worker-friendly regulation that basically effectively nationalizes the major American corporations. They're going to be run as worker cooperatives. Like no one's going to give a damn about the shareholder. So before the shareholders figure out that they're the patsies, sell your U.S. stocks. You need to be aware of this political risk, because the worse the economy gets, the greater the political risk, right? The more of our individual liberties are going to be lost as people are scrambling for somebody to help them, not knowing that the reason they need help is because of all the government help in the past. That wasn't help at all. The government causes all the crisis and then comes riding to the rescue, right? They're the firemen that light the fires. And then they say, oh, look, we're here to put it out. Yes, we'll stop lighting them. So you got to get out of your U.S. assets. Talk to my brokers at Euro Pacific Capital. Transfer an account over, IRAs, retirement, regular accounts, so that we can manage the money outside the U.S. Yes, I know other countries are screwing up their currencies. There's going to be inflation all over the world. The difference is there won't be hyperinflation all over the world. There will probably in the United States. The other countries aren't going to lose their reserve currency status because they don't have it to lose. Other countries are already producing more than they consume. They're already saving more than they borrow. They are viable. It's America that's in for a rude awakening. We have a date with destiny and an awakening coming, but you don't want to be there for that awakening. You don't want to keep that date personally. I mean, as Americans, we're going to have to deal with it, but I'd rather deal with it as a solvent American than as a broke American, because the vast majority of Americans are going to be wiped out by this. They're not going to be wiped out by the coronavirus, but by the government's cure for the coronavirus that started long before anybody ever thought up the word coronavirus, right? We started this decades ago, and Alan Greenspan may have started it, but Jerome Powell is going to finish it, most likely, unless somebody else gets appointed by Biden who's different. And then that person maybe will be the fall guy or gal. We'll see. But this is not, there's not another 10, 12 years. That's not going to happen. Don't think there's any way that that's going to happen. We have now accelerated the time scale. Think about where you were a month ago, right? Did you think any of this nonsense was possible? Had you ever seen anything like this outside of a science fiction movie? No. Well, as I said, you ain't seen nothing yet. It's going to get a whole lot worse. And before it does, at least get prepared financially, and then maybe try to get prepared emotionally. Anyway, let me try to take some questions. I know there's a bunch of questions. I got to turn. Is there a password to this other computer? Yeah. Because it's better not to have them, because it just makes it harder to get in. All right. So I'm going to start taking the questions. I guess I take them in order of the dollar value. This is a $150 question. And pretty soon, $150 will be what you pay for a carton of eggs, if you're lucky. And then the question is, how long will it be before that same carton of eggs costs $300? And then how long before there is no carton of eggs? And if you want a carton of eggs, you got to find the farmer, and you got to give him some silver. Otherwise, he's not giving you his eggs. Anyway, let me see this question. It says, is Euro Pacific Capital compliant with AAOIFI standards, accounting, auditing, financial institution is worth doing? The floodgates of mud. I don't know. I mean, I'm not familiar with every single rule, but we're compliant with everything that we're required. I'm not the compliance officer. And Euro Pacific Capital right now is a division. I sold the BD. The new owners renamed it Alliance Global Partners. And yeah, I mean, they got a chief compliance officer. We got all kinds of guys that make sure we comply with all of the FINRA rules, all the SEC rules. Most of these rules, I think, are counterproductive and simply run up the costs unnecessarily by design as a mechanism to keep out competition for the major broker dealers. That's how all regulation works. Government regulates small business to make it harder for small businesses to get started and make it harder for those who are in business to stay in business. All of it is about protecting the larger corporations that basically buy the politicians with their campaign donations. Anyway, next up is Adam, who is a huge fan. Please discuss economic rise of Germany despite World War I reparations and the Great Depression of using debt. Well, Germany, I mean, the big problem with Germany is Weimar Republic and hyperinflation. And that's where you can go and see the examples of money being carried around in wheelbarrows. And there's a famous story about somebody who left a wheelbarrow full of Reichsmarks on the sidewalk and went into a store. And when they came back out, their money was on the ground and the wheelbarrow had been stolen. Right? That just shows you how quickly money can lose value. And what happened to Germany is after the war, the Treaty of Versailles was extremely harsh on Germany. And that was probably a byproduct of the United States having entered the war. And we fought with, the UK and our allies and really crushed the Germans. I think without the U.S. entry into the war, they probably would have negotiated a peace and it would have been more balanced. And therefore, Germany would not have gone through the hyperinflation, which gave rise to Adolf Hitler and World War II and concentration camps. And so you never know what's going to happen, when you knock over the first domino, which is why it's always good not to get involved in foreign wars, because you never know how much greater a problem you might be creating than the one that you think you're solving. But in any event, what happened to Germany is they had agreed to a lot of war reparations. The Germans agreed to pay.
About the Republican bill to raise the debt ceiling. Again, any raise is a mistake. It is a loss. It is bad news because it means that the government will continue not paying its bills, running up debt instead of paying its bills. So the national debt keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we get closer and closer to a debt crisis, which is the only way that this thing is going to come to an end. We've been raising the debt ceiling now for 100 years, more than 100 years, and look what it's got us. It's got us $32 trillion of debt. None of this brinksmanship, none of these showdowns over the debt have done anything to stop the compounding of the debt, because they always raise the ceiling. The only thing that would make a difference is to leave that ceiling in place. But then, of course, we accelerate all of the pain, like all the bad things, all the horrible pain that the Democrats say, is going to happen if we don't raise the debt ceiling. All of that is going to happen because we are raising the debt ceiling. It's just going to happen worse. It's going to happen later, but it's going to happen much worse. So we should deal with it now, but we won't, because even these little itsy bitsy cuts, using that word lightly, that the Republicans have opposed, well, that's too much. So if the Democrats aren't even willing to do this little teeny bit, then where are we going to go? Now, it's not that there's nothing good in the Republican bill. I mean, there's some stuff in there that's good. I mean, for example, they kill the student loan debt forgiveness. So that's a good thing. And, that helps the debt. And by the way, one of the reasons that deficits have exploded is because so many people who have student loans aren't paying. And I think that maybe is it the first of the month or it's coming up real soon. But supposedly, everybody who hasn't been making their student loan payments, they got to start paying. I think it's like maybe May 1st. I got to look that up, but it's happening very soon. All these people who for the last 2 or 3 years haven't made any student loan payments. They haven't made any interest payments. They haven't made any principal payments. So they've been living off this extra money. Now, all of a sudden, they have to start making these payments. And that may help reduce the deficit a little bit. But what is that going to do to all these individuals and these families? They're going to lose that extra money. They're basically getting the equivalent of a tax hike. And that is going to hurt, especially considering that prices have been going up. Inflation is driving up prices. One way people were able to cover those costs was that they didn't have to make their student loan payments. Well, now they have to start making those payments, so they won't have that money to pay for this more expensive stock. So that's another accident waiting to happen. Also, the Republican bill kills the extra money for the IRS. Now, supposedly, that was actually going to bring in revenue because we were going to unleash, all these IRS agents like a swarm of locusts, and they were going to cover the country, and they were going to extract new revenue that they sucked out of taxpayers. Now, of course, the government said that these locusts were just going to go for the millionaires and billionaires. There's no money there. They're already paying a lot, and then the taxes that they avoid, they do it legally. They use legal loopholes to minimize their taxes. The people who are cheating are the middle class, right? Because they can't afford these expensive lawyers. They don't qualify for these loopholes. So the only way they can survive is to cheat. And I'm not, going to blame somebody if the only way they can feed their family and pay their rent is if they cheat on their taxes. Well, that's what they're doing. I'm not going out there and advising people to do that. I'm just recognizing that it happens. And small businesses, they're far more likely to, cheat on their taxes. Self-employed, small businesses where they, put a lot of their personal expenses on their business. Maybe they earn some cash. And of course, the people that earn a lot of cash, the guys in the gig economy, right? Those guys, they're not paying a lot of taxes. They've got a lot of unreported income. People that get tips don't report. They get a really big tip. They don't report that. If it's cash, they put it in their pockets, right? So this is what's going on. That's who the Democrats were going to target with these IRS agents. So, but if the Republicans, cut that expense, in theory, they're also going to miss out on the extra tax revenue. But, to the extent that a lot of these IRS agents start targeting business owners, entrepreneurs, that's going to hurt the economy. They might end up firing a bunch of people because they're dealing with all these government tax collectors. And so they may not actually get the tax revenue, because if you harass small business owners and make them spend a lot of money defending themselves against government audits, well, that, they don't have as much time to grow their business. You deplete them of the resources that they needed to invest in their business and to hire people. I mean, we don't want businessmen having to spend all their time fighting off the IRS. And so to the extent that these agents just added additional, red tape to a small business owners, business, it would have been a net negative. So it might have even backfired, and maybe even all these extra IRS agents would have resulted in lower tax collection, not the higher collection that they were banking on based on recovering all this money. The other thing that they repealed is some of these green energy tax credits or whatever, some stuff, Green New Deal kind of things that made it into the Inflation Reduction Act. I can't help but laugh, when I say the Inflation Reduction Act, it's just such a joke, because the Inflation Reduction Act was paid for by inflation. Where did the money come from to finance all the spending from the Inflation Reduction Act? It came from inflation. So the Inflation Reduction Act was itself inflationary. So a bill with the name of reducing inflation, by passing that bill, they guaranteed higher inflation. Again, government always achieves the opposite of whatever they title their legislation, which is why there should be a law, truth in legislating, because if that law were in effect, they would have to have named this bill the Inflation Acceleration Act, or the Act to Increase Inflation. But if they labeled it what it actually did, how many congressmen are going to vote to increase inflation? Try to explain that vote to your constituents. Yeah, I voted for the Inflation Acceleration Act because we didn't think we had enough inflation, and so I voted for more. Nobody can explain that vote. But it's much easier to explain the vote to reduce inflation. Yes, of course I voted for the Inflation Reduction Act, even though the act increased inflation. That's not the name. So you can vote to increase inflation, but then take credit for voting to decrease inflation because of the fraud involved in naming the legislation. It's ironic because the government wants to go after fraud in the private sector if somebody defrauds their customers, but they're totally allowed to defraud their voters, because basically that's the customer, right? If you're a politician, your customers are the ones that vote for you. But you don't have to be honest with them at all. You can just tell them a pack of lies, and it's totally fine. Just like when Biden says that, oh, we don't want to hurt American families, so we just want a clean bill to raise the debt ceiling. Those American families are on the hook to repay that debt. All of your debt, when you want to look at how much debt you have, you just can't look at your own debt. You just can't look at your mortgage or your car loan or your student loan or credit card debt. You have to look at your share of the national debt. Every American is on the hook to pay their share. And of course, you're actually on the hook to pay a lot more than your share, because a big chunk of Americans don't pay any taxes at all. So if you're not paying any taxes at all, then your share is going to have to be paid for by somebody who is paying taxes. And of course, it's not just per capita, because the babies aren't paying, right? If you have a 2-year-old or a 4-year-old or they're not kicking in, right? So you got to get rid of all the little kids. It's the people that are working and paying taxes. They have a share of the national, and it's several $100,000 a person. It's huge. And they keep increasing this collective liability that everybody has. Reduction in CPI. Prices are going to keep on rising as a result of all that spending. Now, while I'm on the topic of government spending, the debt ceiling again is in the news. And I was reading some quotes online from Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, talking about this. And you would think, right, if she's the Secretary of the Treasury, her job in theory should be to reassure all the bondholders that America is good for its debts, right? We're going to pay our debts. So don't worry, we will do what it takes to pay you, right? I'm the Secretary of the Treasury, and I'm going to make sure that we prioritize our bondholders. They're going to take priority because, that's the full faith and credit of the United States, right? We can't default on that. That would be horrific. So don't worry, about the debt ceiling. We will pay you. We will find a way. We will cut other spending. We'll do something, but we're going to pay. No, that's not what Janet Yellen is saying, right? Here's one quote from Janet Yellen. Quote, all I want to say is that it's Congress's job to do this, meaning raise the debt ceiling. If they fail to do it, we will have an economic and financial catastrophe that will be of our own making. And there is no action that the President Biden, the U.S. Treasury, can take to prevent this catastrophe. And the catastrophe she is talking about is default on the debt, where the U.S. misses a debt payment. Now, if this is so catastrophic, why don't we just avoid it? Again, I've talked about how much tax revenue we have that's well in excess of the interest payments on the debt. Interest payments are something like what, $300-400 billion a year. We're collecting 10 times that in taxes, what, $4 trillion. So we got plenty of tax revenue to pay our debts. But we're not saying we're going to use that tax revenue to pay our debts. No. If we can't borrow more money to pay our debts, then we're not going to pay anything. Again, an admission of a Ponzi scheme. But this is the last thing that you should be saying. I mean, we got people worried about the dollar, worried about the weaponization of the dollar. And we're telling our creditors, you're the low man on the totem pole. It's not really that there's the full faith and credit, because if you own a treasury, the only way you're going to get paid is if we pay everybody else and there's still money left over. Otherwise, you're SOL, right? If we can't go deeper into debt, nobody is saying, right? I haven't heard Janet Yellen or anybody say, you know what, if the Republicans don't raise the debt ceiling, we can't send out the Social Security checks. No, it's all about the debt. The only people who are going to get screwed are the people who own U.S. treasuries. Does that make any sense? Is that what the Secretary of the Treasury should be out there saying? Now, one of the things they're trying to say is that, well, we're going to use the 14th Amendment or something like that to get around the debt ceiling, because they're saying that, that amendment says that that U.S. debt shall not be questioned. But that's irrelevant to whether or not we have the money to pay. It's not about questioning the legitimacy of the debt. I mean, no one's doing that. Yes, the debt is legitimate. We just don't have any money to pay it, right? So to say that, we have to pay the debt, and therefore we can raise the debt ceiling. No, if they want to prioritize the debt, they can do it. In fact, what Congress should be doing right now and what Biden should be leading the charge. Hey, where's the contingency plan? If we don't raise the debt ceiling, what government programs are we going to cut, right? So that we can pay interest on the national debt. What are we going to do, right? Because we have to do something. You can't just not raise the debt ceiling and not have a plan. So let's have a plan B. Okay, either we raise the debt ceiling or here's all the government spending that we cut, right? And if we're going to default on the debt, well, let's lay it out. What's the haircut going to be? Who's going to, how much are we going to not pay? But then that is not something that we did to ourselves. We would have chosen to do that. If there is an interest payment that is missed on the national debt, it's because the government chose not to make the payment. They chose to prioritize something else because somebody's going to get paid. It's not like no government checks are going to go out if they don't raise the debt ceiling. Checks are going to go out. They just have to figure out who gets paid. Like any business, you got to prioritize. Or if there's a company, that goes into bankruptcy and there's a trustee or whatever, and he's looking over, figuring out who gets the money, right? Well, if the government can't borrow anymore, right, it's technically kind of broke. So it's got to figure out who gets paid. But right now, they're saying that it's the bondholders who take the first hit, which means, U.S. Treasuries are junk bonds. If that's your collateral, that you're last. See, normally bondholders are going to be higher up in a hierarchy of who gets paid, right? But now, no, they're low man on our totem pole. So why should anybody want to hold treasuries? I mean, you run the risk of inflation wiping out the value of the treasury. You run the risk of default. You run the risk of, having the U.S. weaponize the fact that you own treasuries against you and seize them for you. We've created so many reasons for holders of U.S. treasuries to want to get rid of them. And of course, get rid of the U.S. dollar. There's one more thing too that I want to mention that they're banning about the debt ceiling, and that's this $1 trillion, coin, this platinum coin they want to make, $1 trillion coin, and say, hey, we don't need to worry about borrowing money. We'll just mint a $1 trillion coin and give it to the Fed, and the Fed will give the U.S. government $1 trillion to spend. And if we ever did something like that, it would really expose the banana republic that we're living in, because that would really be the government literally just printing the money, because the Fed would have no real asset on its books. I mean, right now, the Fed's balance sheet consists of U.S. Treasuries on the one hand, and then it issues currency, Federal Reserve notes. So the Federal Reserve notes are backed by a U.S. Treasury. But if the Fed will accept an ounce of platinum as collateral for $1 trillion, its balance sheet has a massive hole in it. What does it have on its balance sheet to stand behind $1 trillion? It doesn't have $1 trillion in U.S. Treasuries. It's got an ounce of platinum. What's that worth? Not even $2,000. How could the Federal Reserve, if it ever had to shrink its balance sheet, what asset would it have to buy back those treasuries? A 1 ounce platinum coin? Who's going to take that? Who's going to say, yeah, I'll sell you my $1 trillion worth of treasuries and I'll take an ounce of platinum in exchange? Who the hell is going to want that? Nobody. If the Federal Reserve ever did that, it would be impossible to shrink the balance sheet, because at least when they have U.S. treasuries, somebody will take the treasuries because they pay interest, right? But who's going to take an ounce of platinum that pays no interest? And what are you going to do with it? You can't do. I mean, you got one coin that's worth $1 trillion. It's not like you could spend it. Where would you want to store that? It's basically what it would be like. It would be like a U.S. Treasury in perpetuity that paid zero, right? Because there's no interest on it, but you can't do anything with it but hold it indefinitely and collect no interest. It's really a worthless asset because the Fed can never do anything with it. So it would mean a permanent increase in the money supply. So it's permanent inflation, and the Fed has no ability to ever withdraw that liquidity unless the government decides that it wants its coin back. But why should it ever want it back? If it could just, mint $1 trillion coin and hand it to the Federal Reserve, why would it ever want it back, right? The Federal Reserve would be stuck with it. But this would expose, right, the whole fraud in the system, that it's just money printing. It's never going to stop. We're never going to get our fiscal house in order. Instead of all this talk about the fact that the U.S.
You end the moral hazard and you stop building another bubble on top of the collapsed foundation of the prior bubble. You have a healthy economy on a sound foundation that will never need another bailout again, that will deliver rising standards of living to all that live in the country. And then we won't have this constant cry for socialism. This is from Dino. Peter, how do you respond to my friends who claim you only push gold because you're heavily invested? Okay. Aside from gold, what else can I buy? First of all, gold is a huge market. So number one, no matter how much I go on television, if they had me on television, or no matter what I say on YouTube about gold, it's not going to influence the price. It's not like I just came out with a new crypto coin and I'm trying to pump it up and I need somebody to buy it. I don't need anybody to buy gold, right? I mean, the gold price is going to be unaffected by what I say. And if every single person who is listening to me today bought some gold, it would have no effect on the price. It's a big, deep, liquid market. Now, if the whole country did, okay, but the whole country's not going to listen to me, right? That's a reality. I mean, they should be listening to me, but they're not, which is lucky for the people who are, at least financially, because you get to buy gold. Why is gold only up $50 today? It should be up 100. Wait a minute, it should be up 1,000. It should have already been up. People are so ignorant, right? They're like that frog that's about to get boiled in water. Only they don't realize how hot the water is, right? So there's nothing that I say that is going to influence the price. But number two, people might say, well, Peter, you have a company that sells gold, and so you're always going to think that people should buy gold. I didn't just happen to inherit some gold company. Like I won it in a poker game or whatever. Now I got a gold company. Oh, shit, I own a gold company. I guess I got to come up with reasons to buy gold. No, I have a gold company only because I think people should buy gold. And I'm helping them buy it. You see, when I'm selling gold, I'm not selling any of my own gold. I'm buying. I'm still buying gold and silver myself. I am helping other people buy it. I'm not selling my own supply. So when you call up Schiff Gold and you want to buy gold, we don't have the gold to sell you. We buy it from a wholesaler. So I buy gold wholesale and turn around and sell it retail. And I barely mark it up. And the only reason I started my own gold company, because when I started with broker-dealer, when I started at Europe Pacific Capital back in 1999, 2000, 2001, and by the way, gold was under $300 an ounce when I started telling my clients to buy it. It's over $1,500 now. Gold has outperformed the U.S. stock market dramatically over the last 21 years. As people are making fun of me. See, people on CNBC will say, oh, Peter, you just want people to buy gold. Yeah, well, gold's done better than stocks. So why don't you criticize all the people that are telling people to buy overvalued stocks? Now, has gold had a correction? Yes, gold had a correction, just like the stock market now. Although it's having a big bear market now. It's a lot more than a correction. But when I first started telling people to buy gold, I didn't sell any gold. I didn't have a gold company. I was just telling people to go buy physical gold. Then I started working with the Perth Mint. That was around 2002, 2003 in Australia. And I still work with them today. And I started allowing my brokerage companies, if they wanted, to buy physical gold from me, and we stored it in the Perth Mint. And it's a great program. The storage is free. It's a great place. Everybody should have some gold at the Perth Mint. If you don't have any gold at Perth Mint, call us up. Talk to Danny Dwyer at Europe Pacific Capital. We have a special website, goldyoucanfold.com, or just go to europac.com and just, hey, I wanted to fit Perth Mint. It's a great way to store gold and silver, inexpensive. I like Australia as a safe jurisdiction to keep your gold, right? So that's there. But what happened was I was telling people, look, you don't want all your gold stored in Australia. You want to have some diversification. And I said, you want to have some gold in your house, or just where you have it. You don't want it with a third party. You want it in case you need it physically in your hand, like a lot of people are going to need. That's why I tell people to buy silver coins. That's why I just bought a bunch more myself of these 1 ounce rounds, because I think I may need them. I think that might be what people want. There's only so much food and toiletries I can stock up on. I mean, I got plenty of it, believe me. And I encourage everybody to load up on whatever they think they're going to need, whatever's not going to spoil. If you got a big freezer, get a bunch of meat in there. Because worst case scenario, nothing bad happens and you eat that stuff later and you use that stuff later. It's going to get more expensive. In fact, one of the best investments that people who don't have a lot of money can make is think of all the things that you might be buying over the next few years and just buy them now. Because the return you're going to get in the supermarket, at the drugstore, is going to beat the return you're going to get in the stock market. Because consumer goods prices are going to go up faster than stock prices, even if they go up, right? Inflation makes everything go up. Don't be fooled. So buy all that stuff now. Just go load up with it. Worst case scenario, you eat it later, you use it later, and you save some money. But if we get hyperinflation, not only are the price of those goods going to go way up, but there may be no availability. Because I think one of the things the government's going to do early on in the inflationary crisis to slow it down is they're going to impose price controls on all sorts of items. That means rationing. That means long lines. So if you don't want to wait on a long line to buy toilet paper, make sure you have a bunch of it, and don't use as much. Some of you gals, you use, it's incredible how much toilet paper a woman can go through. So us guys can maybe tell, look, you don't need that much toilet paper every time, right? Because I think people are going to have to economize. You ever go overseas and see some of the toilet paper they got, how thin it is? It's incredible. I mean, we have nice thick paper because we've been used to this, So we might even have to start tearing it apart so that we can make more use out of the paper we got. That's where we're headed. So stock up on this stuff. Not just because the price may go up, because you may not be able to get it. But the reason I want to own a lot of physical silver is because if you want to get that stuff in the future, you will jump to the head of the line if you got silver. Probably not the line. It's not the official line. You'll be in the unofficial black market line in the alley. Like, hey, you want to get the good stuff? Here, I got the real thick toilet paper right here, right? You got any silver, right? That's what's going to happen. People are going to want that fiat currency that's losing value so fast. In the Weimar Republic, all kinds of stories. If you went out to a restaurant, you had to agree with the restaurant on the price of the meal before you ate it. Because if you waited until you finished the meal, you couldn't afford it because the price would go up so much while you were eating it. Stuff is crazy when prices really start to go. Money's like a hot potato. Nobody wants to hold it. The minute you get it, you want to get rid of it. But if you have real money, silver, gold, then you can function. But so the other reason that I want people, let me backtrack. So I wanted people to own the physical gold, not just the Perth Mint. And I didn't sell it. I only did the Perth Mint. So I started telling my clients, buy some gold. Just go call up a gold dealer. I didn't recommend anybody in particular. I just didn't want to refer somebody to somebody, then have them, get ripped off and blame me. So I was like, look, go find a gold dealer and buy some coins, buy some gold and silver coins. And then what happened was I started to hear a lot of horror stories about people who went out and bought gold and silver because I said to, but then they got sold, bogus stuff. They got talked into numismatics. Oh, they're going to confiscate gold like they did in 1933, and you got to buy this British sovereign or whatever. And they ended up paying like 40%, 50%, 60%, 100% markups. So even though they bought gold, like when it was 400 and they called me and gold is 600, their coins are worth less than they paid because they got conned by these unreputable gold companies that spend a fortune advertising. And it really pissed me off because these guys were advertising, and a lot of them still advertise today on all the big right-wing talk shows, right, that were talking about inflation back then when I was, right? They were saying, buy gold, buy gold. And then they were sending their listeners to get ripped off by the companies that were paid to promote them. And that really, really bothered me. So I decided, I can't trust the gold community. And one of the reasons that these dealers are so unreputable is because the demand for gold is so slow. Nobody can afford to advertise because the market is so tiny, right? Nobody's interested in gold. And if you honestly mark it up like I do, you mark your coins up 1%, 2%. How do you advertise? You can't. So the only way a lot of these small gold firms can afford to pay these talk show hosts to promote them is if they rip off all the business that the talk show hosts send them. They have to charge a lot of money because they have to pay for the endorsements. They got to pay for the commercials. You see a gold company advertising on CNN, on Fox. Where do you think they're getting the money for those ads? Because they're not selling enough gold. Because I know because I have a gold company. Sales are way down. So the only way anybody can afford to advertise on television is to rip off their customers to pay for those ads. See, I don't advertise. I've never advertised. Schiff Gold has never spent a nickel on advertising. All I did is set it up so that I would have a place to refer my brokerage customers. And so now more people are buying it, and the business has gotten bigger and bigger. I eventually partnered up with Goldmoney. And so, we're working on that together, but it's the same principle, right?
I started talking about this was because the media is looking at what's going on, and they're surprised by these events as if they just kind of happened out of left field and nobody could have predicted them. And remember, that's exactly what they were saying at the financial crisis in 2008, that nobody could have predicted it. It was a 100-year flood, a black swan, right? It was like, just happened. No, it didn't, because I was predicting it publicly for years. It was obvious to me what was going to happen as a result of these artificially low interest rates that inflated the housing bubble. I saw it. I knew people were taking on more debt than they can repay because rates were so low, and banks were extending credit in that environment to people who were not going to be able to repay their mortgages. I even remember being critical of the fact that when people were taking out adjustable rate mortgages, you could get a Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac guaranteed mortgage just based on your ability to afford the teaser rate. So the U.S. government was guaranteeing that a mortgage would be repaid, but only looking at somebody's income relative to the initial teaser rate on their mortgage. So let's say somebody was earning $2,000 a month and they had a mortgage, and the mortgage was, let's say, $1,000 a month, mortgage payment, and the government would guarantee it, say, okay, we're going to guarantee this mortgage, right? The guy's earning $2,000 a month and his mortgage is $1,000 a month, half his income, but we're going to guarantee it. Well, what they didn't look at was, well, what could possibly happen to those payments in the event that interest rates go up? Well, let's say the maximum payment on that mortgage could have gone up to $2,000 a month from $1,000 a month. Well, is the guy going to pay his mortgage if it consumes 100% of his income? Of course not, because he's got to eat. He's got other expenses. Yet the U.S. government was dumb enough to put taxpayer guarantees behind these mortgages. I mean, so everything was obvious to me in the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis. And then, as soon as the government announced their cure, I knew that the new disease would be even worse than the one they were trying to cure. Although it wasn't a new disease, it was just the same disease, right? We just, made it worse. We just, supercharged that disease so it would come back and do even more damage than the original disease. And that is what is going on. But these commentators are acting as if, we couldn't have saw this coming. I mean, especially when they're talking about what's happening in Europe. I mean, Europe had negative interest rates. How dumb was that? And banks were buying bonds with negative interest rates. I was pointing out at the time the absurdity, how much money was going to be lost by the bag holders, right? Yeah, those bonds were fine as long as you weren't caught holding it to maturity. But, all these banks were dumb enough to put this paper on their books and then say, we're holding it to maturity. It was like, a hot potato. You could get the bond, but you had to quickly turn around and pass it to someone else. Maybe kind of like Old Maid, right? You can win the game of Old Maid, with having the Old Maid in your hand. You just can't have it in your hand at the end of the game. Well, the problem is all these banks, they got the Old Maid, right? The game ended, the Fed jacked up rates, and everybody loses. Every card in their hand is Old Maid. Well, I don't know if you can play that game anymore. It might not be politically correct, so maybe some of you younger guys don't even know what I'm talking about. But the point is, the music stopped playing, and they don't have a chair. Maybe musical chairs, maybe you know that one. But this was obvious. In fact, I was so worried about this years ago, when we were still running Euro Pacific Bank, before it was, put into receivership. And it's almost now, it's going to be 9 months since it was put into receivership. And again, I see on the internet, people, want to blame me. Hey, Peter, why aren't your customers getting their money back? It's not my fault. The money's there. It's the governments that aren't letting the money be returned. That's your government in action, right? They bail out some banks that are insolvent, and then they take a completely solvent bank, shut it down, and they refuse to let the bank return the money to the customers. But I think it will hopefully happen soon. Fingers crossed on that. But years ago, when deposit rates were negative on euros, right, and we had a bunch of euros, and we were getting charged to keep the euros in it, and we had to pass that on to our customers. We started charging the negative interest rates to our customers because we were paying the bank where we kept the euros negative rate. Now, we could have moved our euros to Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank actually didn't have a negative rate. They were like the only bank that we could find that wasn't going to charge a negative rate. But we didn't want to put our euros at Deutsche Bank. Why? Well, because we were worried about the solvency. Even back then, I was worried about Deutsche Bank. The reason that Deutsche Bank had to pay higher interest, than other banks the reason that Deutsche Bank had to pay a higher interest rate than other banks was because it was riskier. So anybody who put their money with Deutsche Bank in order to get a higher return or to avoid a negative return, which is the same thing, they were taking additional risk. Now, I didn't want to do that, right? I wanted to keep the money safe. I wanted to put it in a bank that was more reliable, more trustworthy. Because remember, my bank didn't have any deposit insurance. So we had to be frugal. We had to actually look around and make sure that the banks that we were putting money with. And at one point, we had a lot of accounts. We had accounts with like 6 or 7 major banks around the world. Now, after the 60 Minutes defamation came out, a lot of these banks that we were working with stopped working with us. So we had to move money around. Our choices became limited after that happened. And, all these banks, it wasn't easy to get accounts with these banks. I mean, they did major compliance on my bank because most banks, they couldn't get these accounts. But we had such good, protocols for KYC and AML. I mean, they wanted to do business with us. We had a very good track record until it was destroyed by the false allegations at 60 Minutes. But again, I don't want to get into that again. But the point I'm making is, way back then, there was risk in Deutsche Bank, and it was apparent. So how are people now so surprised? Oh, they've got a problem in European banking? They've raised interest rates. They've barely started to raise rates. What is it, 3% in the Eurozone? It's 4% in the UK. They got 10% inflation. They're not even close to rates high enough to fight that inflation. Imagine what would be going on in Europe right now if they did raise rates high enough to fight inflation. I mean, could you imagine if everything is collapsing now and the rates are still this? Home sales continue to fall. And in fact, at this point, year over year, the decline in home sales is now an all-time record. We've never seen year-over-year sales fall this much, including the crash in 2007, 2008, when the housing bubble popped. It's already worse than that. But what we haven't seen yet is the collapse in home prices. That's coming, and we haven't seen the surge in inventories of unsold homes. That's coming too. In fact, a lot of people, I believe, are going to put their houses on the market once they see what's happening to the market. They're going to want to get out while they can.
Peter Schiff, the renowned American investor and economist, has been warning for years about the potential for a coming economic crisis, and now it seems his predictions are becoming a reality. In a recent podcast released on his YouTube channel, Schiff declared that a collapse in home prices and a surge in inventories of unsold homes is imminent, as most people will lose their homes and jobs. His stark assessment of the current economic situation has caused alarm amongst the public, as many fear what the future may bring. Schiff's dire predictions have been met with both criticism and praise, as some believe his warnings are exaggerated, while others believe they are accurate and timely. For those skeptical of Schiff's predictions, it is worth noting that he accurately predicted the 2008 financial crisis and has warned of another one for years. Regardless of whether or not his predictions are correct, it is clear that the economic outlook is uncertain and that people should be prepared for the possibility of a downturn. Welcome back to our channel. In this video, Peter Schiff talks about a collapse looming in the housing market and the possibility of people losing their homes and jobs. Please watch, like, and share this video. Also, drop your comments and thoughts below, and remember to subscribe to the channel for more related content similar to this. We begin with a short clip of Peter Schiff.
And I'm convinced that Q4 is going to be another negative quarter. So the first 2 quarters of the year were negative. We have the one lone positive quarter in Q3. I think not only will Q4 return to a negative quarter, but I think it could be the biggest negative quarter of the year. So ending the year on a low note, even though we may end on a high note in the financial markets, we'll end on a low note in the real economy. And of course, that will be the reason for the rally, because it will add to the expectation of the Powell pivot and the false belief that the inflation fight has been won. The reality is the inflation fight has been lost. And that's because investors still incorrectly believe that a weakening economy will also weaken inflation. It won't. It will strengthen inflation. Stagflation is going to get worse. It's going to be a combination of recession and high inflation. And the markets are not prepared for that. The Fed is not prepared for that. Nobody, other than me perhaps, is prepared for that, and people who have been following my investment advice. But getting back to these numbers, we got the advanced look at trade deficit in merchandise for the month of October. Now, remember, I said that the reason that we had growth in Q3 was because the trade deficit came down. Well, in October, the trade deficit shot back up, and that is the first month of the fourth quarter. The expectation was for the deficit to actually fall from a slightly downwardly revised $91.9 billion in September to $90.8 billion in October. Instead, the deficit soared in the other direction all the way up to $99 billion, not only blowing away the estimate by 10%, but far exceeding the upper end of the range of estimates, which went from a low of $88.3 billion to a high of $94 billion. So this $99 billion deficit is huge. And in fact, it's even worse when you look at the internals, because imports were up 0.9, but exports collapsed 2.6%. So our economy is exporting less, but our consumers are importing more because we keep on spending money to buy stuff that we didn't make.
Schiff said he predicted Q4 of the year to be another negative quarter, and he was right with his prediction. We saw the trade deficit, which came down in Q3, coming back up in the first month of Q4. The world's financial markets have been in disarray, with stocks plummeting and currencies losing value. Businesses are closing their doors, and people are struggling to make ends meet. It is a true crisis that is showing no signs of subsiding, and it has become impossible to ignore the dire situation we find ourselves in. Despite the immense hardship, however, there is still hope. With resilience and determination, individuals, families, and communities can still rise above the adversity and rebuild a better future. Listen to these carefully.
If the Fed is going to succeed in bringing down inflation, we have to stop doing that. We have to stop spending, but we're not. We're spending more, as evidenced by the trade deficit, but we're producing less because we're exporting less and importing more. This is bad news for the economy, but it's also going to directly subtract from Q4 GDP. And in fact, look at retail inventories, an advanced look on October inventories, and they fell by 0.2. And the prior month, which was in the third quarter, was originally reported as up 0.4. It actually was revised to minus 0.1. So inventories falling is also going to directly subtract from GDP. But why are inventories starting to fall? Because businesses are starting to wise up, and they're realizing that their customers are broke, and they can't afford to buy. So as they're selling down the inventory they have, they're not restocking it because they know the customers are just not there. In fact, there were some negative comments today coming out of Amazon that supports exactly what I'm saying. But the market just shrugged it off because they were looking at the potential of the Fed throwing in the towel on the inflation fight, given all the weak economic data that was coming out and that investors rightly perceive will cause the Fed to change course. They're wrong in what it's going to do to inflation, but they're right about what's going to happen to the economy and the fact that Powell is going to care more about a collapsing economy than he will high inflation, despite his current rhetoric to the contrary, because he's only talking tough because he thinks the economy can withstand it. But once he realizes that it can't, he's going to be singing a different tune.
Schiff believes that if the Fed wants to succeed in bringing down inflation, there is a need to stop exportation and high spending and encourage more importation. He argues that if the Fed can manage this effectively, it will help stabilize the economy and bring down inflationary pressures. The economy has been slowly crumbling around us for years, and now a great collapse is imminent. Millions of people will lose their jobs and homes, and the shockwaves will be felt across the country. The consequences of this collapse are far-reaching, and it's a devastating blow to the financial security of many. Economic uncertainty is the game's name now, affecting everyone, from the average citizen to large businesses. Banks are tightening their lending practices, businesses are downsizing, and people have to make difficult decisions about their financial futures. The collapse would surely create a ripple effect that will be felt for years to come. Listen to these carefully.
We also got more weak data on the housing market. What would you expect? We got pending home sales that fell a little bit less than expected. They were down 4.6%. The problem is there's going to be a glut of sellers and a lack of qualified buyers because mortgage rates are close to 7%. That is the problem. People can't afford to pay these prices with these interest rates. When interest rates were 3.5%, people could afford it. I mean, they couldn't afford it, but they could qualify for the mortgage, and based on the low payments, they could swing it. But they can't swing it anymore because they can't get those low payments because those low rates no longer exist. And so the market has to reprice for higher interest rates, and the implications are severe because this is going to be a dramatic decline in home prices. Now, a lot of people are going to initially assume that that means inflation is coming down because real estate prices are going down. No, doesn't mean that at all. Just like stock prices going down doesn't mean inflation is coming down. It just means inflation is moving from financial assets like stocks or real estate to consumer goods. And again, as I've been reiterating on this podcast, housing prices coming down doesn't mean the cost of shelter is going down. It's not. It's going up because what counts is not how much you pay for the house, but what your monthly mortgage payments are after you buy the house. And even if the price of the house is down, if the mortgage interest is higher, the monthly payments on a lower priced home could still be higher due to the increased interest rates. But the mortgage is not the only portion of the shelter. There's insurance, there's maintenance, there's utilities, there's taxes. All of that adds to the cost of home ownership. And all of those prices are going to be going up. So investors will initially be fooled into thinking that falling real estate prices will provide some kind of relief in the CPI, but it won't, because shelter costs are going to go up even as real estate prices are coming down. And so that's a 1-2 punch to the average homeowner because the value of his asset, his home, is going down, but the cost of living in that home and the cost of everything else is going up. So as the cost of living rises, your net worth is falling, you're poorer, so you have the reverse wealth effect.
According to Schiff, the fluctuation in stocks cannot be compared to inflation. He believes that if stock prices go down, it does not necessarily mean that inflation will go down as well. This is also similar to housing prices and the cost of shelter. The world is currently standing on the edge of a great collapse. This is a time of great uncertainty, as the future of the global economy hangs in the balance. As the pandemic continues to surge, more and more people are being affected. Many are facing job losses, and a great number of people are at risk of losing their homes. This is a time of great fear and distress, but it is also a time for hope and resilience. There is still time to take action and weather the storm, but it will take determination and courage to get through this difficult period. Listen to these carefully.
Most Americans, their largest asset is their home equity, and their home equity is going to be vanishing at the same time their cost of living is going to be surging. This makes everything so much worse because, at least in the past, as consumer prices were rising, but wealth was also rising because of increased real estate prices and more home equity, that took some of the sting out of rising consumer prices because at least you were wealthier. But when your home equity is evaporating because real estate prices are plunging, but the cost of living continues to go up, that compounds the misery because consumers no longer have the increased wealth to help offset the effect of higher prices. They're getting poorer as prices are going up. That really stings.
Schiff has been preparing the public for the inevitable economic disaster that will leave most people homeless and unemployed. Some of the things he has warned about include getting out of debt, learning how to invest, and having an emergency fund ready to survive the coming storm. He believes that the current economic system is unsustainable and only those who are prepared and have always followed his advice will make it through the crisis unscathed. With the number of people affected by the pandemic rising and the stock market in a state of flux, it is more important than ever to take Peter Schiff's advice and prepare for the worst. The great collapse is here, and only those who heed Peter Schiff's warnings will be able to survive it. His message is an important reminder to be prepared and to take steps to protect yourself and your family during these turbulent times. That's all for today. Kindly share this video with your family and friends, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more updates like this. Thanks for watching. Anticipate our next video update.
Reserve status. And so Warren Buffett, I don't know if he was asked about it or if he just opined on it, but Warren Buffett said on that score, he doesn't think that the dollar is in danger of losing that because he doesn't see any other currency that is positioned to take the dollar's place. And again, on that, I agree with Warren Buffett. I don't think that any currency should replace the dollar as the reserve currency. But the problem with Warren Buffett's vision is he's looking in the wrong place. He's looking for other currencies and seeing, well, there's problems with the euro, there's problems with the yen, problems with the RMB, and so the dollar is safe because these other fiat currencies, they've got problems of their own. Well, he should look beyond fiat currencies, again, to real money. The alternative that Warren Buffett fails to recognize is gold. Gold is the alternative. And in fact, look at the numbers. Central banks are now buying gold at a record pace. That information just came out. But despite the fact that central banks are buying gold at a record pace, they still don't own nearly as much as they have in the past. They have a lot of gold to buy to catch up to where they need to be, which is much, much higher than they are right now. So the world is already in the process of replacing US dollars with gold. And dollar did not replace another fiat currency. It replaced gold. Prior to Bretton Woods, all the currencies were backed by gold. Not another fiat currency, gold. And when the United States was able to convince the world to adopt the dollar standard, it was because the dollar was not only backed by gold, but convertible on demand into gold. $35 got you an ounce of gold. And then Nixon defaulted, 1971, right? All this talk about how the U.S. government has never defaulted. We defaulted on our promise to pay gold. Federal Reserve notes were notes. They were obligations of the U.S. government or the Fed to pay gold. We defaulted and paid nothing. So when you're supposed to pay something and you pay nothing, it's a default. So we defaulted in 1971, spent over 50 years. And now I think the world is going to reject fiat dollars. We told the world that you have to have dollars without gold. And now the world is going to tell us, well, we don't want your dollars anymore. We're going back to gold. And so Warren Buffett doesn't see that. And a lot of people are missing that alternative. They just assume that the dollar is safe because the euro or the yen are no good. And they're overlooking what's obvious, and that is gold. Anyway, though, I want to switch gears and talk about this new, I don't know if they're revelations, but to me, it seems like very concrete proof that President Joe Biden, while he was vice president of the United States, was basically the patriarch of an organized crime family. The Republicans had a press conference today in which they presented a very compelling case that the president and his family committed crimes, and particularly Joe Biden, and because he was the vice president, he's the one that took an oath. He's the one that peddled his influence, not even to Americans, but to foreigners, to foreign interests. He basically accepted over $10 million in bribes, which is basically what this was, over the 8 years he was vice president. And the way he was able to launder all of this criminal money, because this is a crime, earning money this way. When you're the vice president and you are selling influence, you are using your authority for the advantage of people who have paid you money, directly paid you money to do something, and then you do something in exchange for that bribe, that is illegal. And then when you try to disguise the illegal nature of that money through complicated structures, you are laundering that money. You are committing multiple crimes. And I think the Republicans have already made a very compelling case that you don't need to be Perry Mason to get a conviction of Joe Biden. After he was elected president, the Republicans reported that the Biden family created 16 shell companies, all these LLCs with different names, but not a single legitimate business purpose for any of these companies. I mean, first of all, why do they need 16 companies, right? And now these 16 companies with no legitimate business purpose, no operation, no product, no service, they all start getting paid over $10 million. And who knows, maybe it's a lot more than 10 million. I don't know. I said over 10 million. And all the money is coming from foreign entities, right? China or other countries are paying all this money to these shell companies. And then the shell companies start moving the money around without any purpose among each other, right? Money goes from one to the other. And then ultimately it gets distributed to Joe Biden's family, just his family. 9 different family members receive money from these 16 shell companies. You got his brother that got money, his daughter-in-law, his wife, even his ex-wife got in on the action. His grandkids were getting money. Nieces and nephews were getting money. What were they doing? They weren't doing anything. The only person who was probably doing something was the big guy, Joe Biden. Maybe to a lesser extent, his son, Hunter, maybe was able to throw a little weight around Washington, D.C. because everybody knew, that he was the big guy's son. And so maybe, he could lean on people in place of his dad. But without his dad, he didn't have any muscle. But I'm sure that Joe Biden was delivering because these payments would not have continued for 8 years. I mean, he's getting all this money. People are paying him on multiple occasions. Obviously, they're getting something for their money. They're not just, giving all this money to the Bidens, because they like them. Obviously, they're paying for something. They're not fools. They're not going to give over $10 million and get nothing in return. Now, what's really amazing to me is even more so than what Biden did, because this doesn't surprise me that you have a criminal and a liar who's a politician. I mean, that shouldn't shock anybody, right? That Biden would do this. I mean, think about Joe Biden. He's been in politics most of his life. He had 6 terms in the U.S. Senate, 36 years before being vice president for 8 years. So, that's more than half the guy's life has been in the U.S. government. Now, what did he do before he went into politics? Well, he was a student. He went to law school, and then he was a lawyer for a few years before, I think he did 1 term, in local government before he ended up in the United States Senate. But you don't get elected 6 times, telling the truth. In order to be as successful as Joe Biden was in politics, you got to lie. You got to be a really good liar to get elected that many times. And Joe's a good liar. I mean, after all, he started out as a lawyer, right? There's an old joke about lawyers. How do you know a lawyer is lying? His lips are moving. But, one of the reasons that lawyers have to be good liars is because lawyers have to argue their client's side of any controversy, whether it's civil or whether it's criminal. Now, of course, a lot of times your argument is BS. Somebody hires you and they're wrong, right? Either you're a criminal defense lawyer and you got a guilty client and you got to lie and pretend he's innocent, or you're defending somebody in a civil action and you know that they probably did it, but you have to argue that they didn't, right? You've got to argue your client's position, even if you're arguing a lie. So to be a good lawyer, you got to be a good liar. That's part of being a lawyer, being a liar. I mean, the words are almost the same.